Okay, so we're still in Module 2 over logic. This is Lesson 2. It is a lot longer than Lesson 1. We talk about equivalent statements and variations of conditional statements. So some of the definitions, we have a conditional statement and it says if then. This is going to be our given statement that we start out with. This is like our original statement. And then these three, converse, inverse, and contrapositive, these are going to tell us what we do with our conditional statement. So the converse, it says to flip your conditional statement. The inverse, we are going to negate your conditional. And then the contrapositive, you do both. You flip and negate your conditional statement. And then for the notations and formulas, this is just like an example. This is like if we were starting with P and Q representing a statement. So let's say that P is it's cloudy, and then Q is it's raining. So our conditional statement, let's say that we start out, if it's cloudy, then it's raining. So if P, then Q. So P first, and then our arrow, and then Q. This is our given statement. And then they tell us to find the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. The converse, it tells us to flip. So Q comes to the front, and then P goes to the end. So if it's raining, then it's cloudy. The inverse, we negate both sides. So the order stays the same from our conditional statement. P is first, so we just have a negative P and then a negative Q. So if it's not cloudy, then it's not raining. And then the contrapositive, we do both. We flip and we negate both sides. So we flip, so Q comes first, and we make it negative. So negative Q, then negative P. So if it's not raining, then it's not cloudy. So like I said, the conditional statement is always going to be our given statement. And this is going to be always valid. Our original statement is always valid. The converse and the inverse are invalid. And then the contrapositive is going to be valid. So let's look at an example. Our example has the conditional statement as if it's a BMW, it's a car. So if I was to just label this with like P's and Q, we would have if P, then Q. We could just name them those. If it's a BMW, it's a car. So this statement is valid because it's our given statement. Our converse, we flip. So Q comes first, then P. If it's a car, it's a BMW. So this one is not valid because if it's a car, it doesn't have to be a BMW. It could be a Mustang or something else. So the converse is always going to be invalid. Same thing on the inverse. These two are invalid. And if we read the sentence, if it's not a BMW, so we have negative P, it's not a car, and that doesn't make sense. The contrapositive, if it's not a car, okay, so now we switch and we negate. We have negative Q first and then negative P. If it's not a car, it's not a BMW. This one is valid. All right, so some of our exercises, they want us to write the inverse, the converse, inverse, and contrapositive of each statement. So A says, if I am in Chicago, then I am in Illinois. So this is going to be our conditional statement. This is what we are given. And this is the one that we are going to be changing and manipulating whenever we find the converse, inverse, and contrapositive. So we learned how to put these statements into symbols. So we can name them anything that we want. So let's name this, if I am in Chicago, then I am in Illinois. Let's name it if P, then Q. So if I am in Chicago is going to be P, and then I am in Illinois is going to be Q. So our conditional statement is if P, then Q. When we find the converse, inverse, and contrapositive, we just have to follow the roles for each one. The converse, we are going to switch sides. The inverse, we are going to negate both sides. And then our contra, we do both. So the converse, we are going to switch sides. So Q comes first, then P. If Q, then P. For our inverse, we are going to negate both sides. So remember, order is going to stay the same from our conditional statement. So P becomes negative, and then Q becomes negative. So if not P, then not Q. And then our contrapositive, we do both. So we negate and we switch sides. So Q comes first and it is negative, and then we have negative P. So we can use these symbols and write out each of these statements. The converse is going to be if Q, then P. So if I am in Illinois, then I am in Chicago. The inverse, if not P, then not Q. So if I am not in Chicago, then I am not in Illinois. And then the contrapositive, we have negative Q, then negative P. So if I am not in Illinois, I'm not in Illinois, then I am not in Chicago. And remember, if they were to ask us if these were valid or invalid, just remember the converse is always invalid and the inverse is always invalid. And then the contra is always valid. But on these specific ones, they're not going to ask you that on the homework. B, if the stereo is playing, then I cannot hear you. So we'll do the same thing. We'll name this P and then this one Q. This is our conditional statement. So we'll do the same thing. We have if P, then Q. Our converse, we switch sides. Q comes first, then P. Our inverse, we negate. So order stays the same. P becomes negative, and then Q becomes negative. And then the contrapositive, we do both. We switch sides, and we make them negative. So our converse is if Q, then P. So if I cannot hear you, then the stereo is playing. Let me put a box around. Okay. The inverse, we have negative P and then negative Q. So if the stereo isn't playing, then okay, so we start off with a negative Q, that I cannot hear you. If we make Q negative and we have not Q, then Q becomes positive. So negative Q would be that I can hear you. Okay. So what that would look like is, all right, the contrapositive. We make Q negative and it comes first. So if I can hear you, then the stereo is not playing. So you won't have to write these out in the homework. They'll give you multiple choice. All right, C and D, they give the conditional statements as letters. So these are a little bit easier because we're not writing everything out. So if not Q, then not R. This is what we start with. This is our conditional. The converse, the rule for converse is we switch sides. So negative R comes first, then negative Q. We have to keep the squigglies on because that's what we're starting with. The inverse, we negate both sides. So whenever we have a negative and a negative like this, it becomes positive. So they kind of cancel each other out. So we would have positive Q, then positive R. And then the contrapositive, we do both. We switch and negate. So R will come first, and it's going to be a positive R, and then positive Q. Alrighty. D, we start off with negative P and then positive R. So if not P, then R. The converse, we switch sides. So R comes first, positive R, and then negative P. Inverse, we negate both sides. So remember, a double negative becomes positive. So negative P becomes positive P. And then we negate the R. The contrapositive, we do both. So our negative R comes first, and then our positive P. All right, this next part, you are going to be given this table. And it has an example of valid arguments and invalid arguments. So this other section is called arguments and truth tables. And then we have the definitions for valid and invalid. So valid, it says that the conclusion is true whenever the premises are assumed to be true. And then invalid is an argument that is not valid. So what this little table is basically a cheat sheet to tell you if an argument is valid or invalid. So you'll start by writing your argument in symbolic form. So let me put that up here. Start by writing your argument in symbolic form. So the way that you will write your argument, let's look at our direct reasoning argument. We have if P then Q, and then we have P. Okay, so these 3 dots is red, therefore. So we have 2 premises. We have premise 1 and premise 2. Premise 1 is if P then Q. Premise 2 is just P. And then we have our conclusion, therefore Q. So what you're going to do is take our conclusion and bring it up. And whenever these 2 match, it is our repeat of our conditional statement. So that is our direct reasoning. So that is how you're going to look at these arguments. So on our contrapositive reasoning, we have if P then Q, and then we have negative Q, therefore negative P. So if I do the same thing and bring negative P up, then what this is our contrapositive. Because Q is first, so we've switched our sides, and it's negative now, so we have negated. So the contrapositive reasoning is valid. And then we have a couple others, disjunctive reasoning and transitive reasoning. So I'm going to get into more of these in some of the exercises. And then down here, we've got invalid, we've got the converse and the inverse. And then we have some other examples of invalid arguments over here. But like I said, we're going to get into those. So let's look at our first exercise. It says to determine whether the symbolic form of the argument is valid or invalid. So this is already in symbolic form, so we don't have to worry about manipulating our argument or putting it into symbolic form. So let's just follow those other steps. We have if P, then Q. So that's what we start off with. This is our conditional statement. And then we have negative P, therefore negative Q. So what we want to do is bring this up. We want to bring our conclusion up so that we can compare and see what's going on. Oops, this is negative. So we start off with if P, then Q. That's our conditional statement. And we end up with negative P, then negative Q. So we have negated both sides. Whenever we look at the converse, inverse, and contrapositive, the one that follows the rule to negate both sides is our inverse. And our inverse is always invalid. And if you look at the table, it has the same example, fallacy of the inverse. All right, this one got separated, so I'm just going to put P and then negative Q right here. Okay, so let's bring negative P up. And it looks like we have switched sides because P was first and now it's at the end. And we've negated. So we have switched and negated. That is the contrapositive. And the contrapositive is valid. All right, C. If P, then Q, and then we have if Q, then R, and then our conclusion is if R, then P. So we can use the table up here, and it tells us that for this to be valid, because this is the only one that uses P, Q, and R, for this to be valid, we go from P to Q, Q to R, then P has to go to R. If R is going to P, like it is down here, then it is invalid. So, and then another way that I can show you, if P goes to Q, and then Q goes to R, then if we continue the arrow, P has to go to R. And if it's not, which it obviously isn't, then it's invalid. All right. Okay, so this one we are going to skip. All right, number 3. Use the standard forms of valid arguments to draw a valid conclusion from the given premises. So they give us these as statements, and we need to first put them into symbolic form and then figure out what the conclusion should be to make it valid. So valid conclusion. So if a person is a chemist, we're on letter A, and we can name these whatever we want. So if a person is a chemist, then that person has a college degree. So I'm going to name this first part P, and then the second part Q. The second premise says, my best friend does not have a college degree. Okay, so college degree goes along with Q, but we have negative Q. So what we see is that we have if P, then Q, and then the second premise is negative Q, therefore blank. So what do we need to make this valid? So in order for it to be valid, we have to either repeat our conditional statement or it can be the contrapositive. So this can be the contrapositive because we do both. We switch sides and we negate. So this is a negative Q and it has switched sides. So we would need a negative P in order to get the contrapositive. So if we did a negative P, then our conclusion would be, therefore, my best friend is not a chemist. B, the writers of My Mother the Car were told by the network to improve their scripts or be dropped from primetime. The writers of My Mother the Car did not improve their scripts. So, improve their scripts is going to be P. Dropped from prime time, we'll make it Q. The writers of My Mother did not improve their scripts, so negative P. So what do we need? Oh, and we have the word or. So if you look at the table, the word or goes along with disjunctive reasoning. So in order for this to be valid, we need to follow one of these rules. So we have if P then Q, P or Q, And then we have negative P. So we have P or Q, and then we have negative P, therefore. So according to our table, what do we need for this to be valid? We need a positive Q. Okay, and then a positive Q would be that they were dropped from prime time. They were dropped from prime time. And then these will be multiple choice on the homework. See, if all electricity is off, then no lights work. So if electricity is off, we'll name it P. No lights work, let's name it negative Q. Our second premise says that some lights work, so we have positive Q. Therefore, so we have if P, then negative Q, and then we have positive Q. So it looks like we have the contrapositive because we have switched sides and it's negative. So our conclusion will be negative P. Therefore, some electricity is not off. And then our last one, if I vacation in Paris, I eat French pastries. So vacation in Paris, I eat French pastries. We have if P, then Q. Our second premise, if I eat French pastries, which is Q, I gain weight. So we have something new, so we'll name it R. Therefore, so we have if P, then Q, and then we have if Q, then R, and we need our valid conclusion, which we talked about. It has to be if P, then R. So you can either use the truth table for the transitive reasoning, if P, then R, or like I showed you over here, we have P going to Q and then Q going to R, therefore P has to go to R. So our conclusion would be, if I vacation in Paris, then I gain weight. Final answer.